Man, video games used to be so much better, didn't they? Back then, games were allowed to just be games, not infinite money-making machines. You didn't have to worry about games shipping completely unfinished or developers trying to lure you in with later updates because they ran out of time. You just had singular, solid games that didn't need expansions to make them actually complete, right? Yeah. That's complete horseshit, ain't it?
Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Sonic & Knuckles. Two games that are also one game, but are still occasionally considered two games, or even discussed as three.
Does anyone else smell burning toast? Because I don't even have any bread in here.
Yeah, among all the other controversies I'm going to be wandering into while reviewing this series, I'm legitimately risking a flame war just by reviewing this specific version of the game, the combined lock-on Sonic 3 and Knuckles, rather than reviewing both games separately. And I do get why, believe me, I do. Sonic 3 is, in fact, a separate game from Sonic & Knuckles, even though they are also, in fact, the exact same game. Again, I know it's confusing. It has always been confusing. Hell, it's called Sonic 3 even though Sonic CD was released before it, and then over a decade after Sonic & Knuckles, which should technically have been Sonic 4 or 5 logically, it released a game actually called Sonic 4. Look, I'm not saying that no single game franchise in the world gives a shit about consistent numbering, but I mean...
So why am I reviewing this as one game and not two or three? Oh, there are a few reasons. For one, it was originally intended to be one game and was only split because of storage limitations and contractual due dates. And they bent over backwards so that it could be experienced as one game, inventing a whole new kind of Genesis cartridge that only ever existed for Sonic & Knuckles. For another thing, frankly, I just think that on their own, Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles are a bit bare bones to talk about solo. Like, what was I going to talk about in the presentation section of Sonic & Knuckles that wouldn't just be me saying, it's like Sonic 3 again? Also, ever since about 2010, Sega has seemingly considered them as one game in compilations and re-releases. Genesis Classics, Sonic Origins, you know what I mean? And most of all, like I alluded to in the intro, Sonic & Knuckles feels most like an expansion pack to me, more than its own game. And if I'm going to talk about the DLC of later Sonic games alongside the games themselves, I might as well cover this predecessor of DLC for Sonic 3. Again though, I fully anticipate the flame war in response to my choice. Frankly, I welcome it. I mean, like I said, the more you call me transphobic slurs in the comments, the more engagement I get.
So, after Sonic 2, STI decided, you know what, maybe having our development team not all speak the same language doesn't work. So they split into two teams, with Japanese developers working on Sonic 3 and the Americans working on Sonic Spinball. So in a way, you could consider that game the true sequel to Sonic 2.
You could, but why would you?
Originally, they planned for Sonic 3 to be a 3D game, possibly with an isometric viewpoint, but that idea ended up being scrapped until 3D Blast. Still, they wanted it to be the biggest game yet, with more story, bigger levels, more music, better graphics. It was going great, until McDonald's came calling. Yeah, according to Wikipedia, one of the main reasons Sega of America was obligated to release Sonic 3 in February of 1994 was because of a tie-in with McDonald's Happy Meal toys. The other, of course, was because the game was on Genesis cartridges, which couldn't hold all the data needed to contain the full game, so they split it directly after the 6th zone, releasing the first half in February and the rest, titled Sonic & Knuckles, in October. This apparently was only a part of the trouble for the development, between the rest of Sega trying to interfere, the Spinball team getting jealous of the 3 team, and Yuji Naka being a bit of a dick to the other developers.
What? Not beloved insider trader developer of Beyond Wonderworld, Yuji Naka? Look, I've never heard anything really bad about him, but I've never heard anything really good either.
Like every other Sonic game thus far, Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles both received critical acclaim, and the combined game is still considered one of, if not the best entry in the whole series. All combined, the two cartridges sold over 4 million copies, though Sonic 3 was the better seller of the two. And of course, the impact the game had on the series is almost undefinable. The introduction of Knuckles, Sonic's first semi-friendly rival, and his charge, the Master Emerald, the presence of a special final boss sequence based around Super Sonic, hell, Tails being able to fly during gameplay, all of it was introduced here. It's genuinely shocking just how many ideas that are now considered integral to the series began with this game. Then again, maybe it shouldn't be. Like the developers were hoping, this was the biggest Sonic game ever at the time, with more levels than any previous game, more boss fights and levels, and a soundtrack that legally can't be played anymore apparently.
And yet I'm using the original soundtrack anyway. Sorry, Jackson Estate, but let's be honest, you have bigger things to worry about than this OST. This is a very beloved game, or pair of games. The fandom obviously loves it, and even most modern reviewers thinks it's pretty damn good. As for me, well, I don't want to give too much away at the start, so let's just say this is maybe one of the best platformers I've ever played.
For once, we have story told through in-game scenes, though you can still consult the manuals if you want to be confused about names. At some point after Sonic 2, the Death Egg crashed into a floating island, better known now as Angel Island, original home of the Chaos Emeralds, maybe. There, Eggman tricks the island's guardian, Knuckles the Echidna, into thinking Sonic and Tails are trying to steal the emeralds from the island, and he has to stop them. Also, there's some prophecy on the island that's depicted in murals and hidden palace that shows Sonic fighting Eggman's mech, which I don't know how exactly Knuckles' ancestors had that kind of foresight. In-game, we see Tails and Sonic arrive on Angel Island, only for Knuckles to attack Super Sonic and steal the Chaos Emeralds.
What a dick!
The game actually has ongoing story throughout, surprisingly enough. To be fair, Sonic 2 and CD both had a couple plot points animated, particularly late in the game. However, with 3 and Knuckles, there are moments in the middle of acts where Eggman's devices mess with the environment, and smooth transitions between each act, and even explanations of how you get from one zone to another. Yeah, this time, if you go into a water level suddenly, you'll know how you ended up there.
Yeah, it's because the Echidna is a dick. A four-headed one at that.
Well, we've hit a new level of graphics here. I know CD is probably more technically impressive, but I think the Sonic 3 style is a lot more appealing. We have some of the best looking environments seen yet, with themes never seen before in the series' history, and all kinds of creative effects in each level. We even have a brand new Sonic sprite, which looks kind of pissed off at everything. I don't know, I kind of like it. It all looks absolutely gorgeous, and frankly, it sounds it too. Admittedly, the sound effects are once again uncomfortably high in the mix, which is unfortunate. However, I think the music here more than makes up for it. Yeah, parts of this soundtrack were apparently composed by Michael Jackson and his team before being reworked by others after Jackson left the project. Why exactly he left and went uncredited is disputed. Either he left because he was unhappy with the Genesis sound quality, or because he was accused of being, well, you know. Either way, someone made this soundtrack, and it's a damn good OST. Each act now has its own backing track, which range between basically the same song with some slight differences in mixing to entirely different tracks with somewhat similar vibes. It's hard to say what my favorite track is, given there are just so damn many of them, but I will say I think Hydrocity Act 1 in particular is really funky.
And yes, I am pronouncing it Hydrocity because every official source spells it as one word, so I'm going to say it as one word. Feel free to make your Megamind jokes below.
Well, from the start, we have a choice of 4 different playstyles: Sonic, Tails, Sonic and Tails, and thanks to the wonders of lock-on technology, Knuckles. Sonic and Tails is similar to Sonic 2, where Tails mostly acts as backup for extra rings and extra attacks, unless a second player decides to pop in for co-op. However, all 3 player characters actually play differently, so let's start with Sonic. It's just like Sonic 2, but now with a mid-air attack. Yes, the Insta-Shield, introduced in Sonic 3 and only in this game set. The Advanced Trilogy and is unlockable in Generations and Mania. It mostly feels like a bit of a balance thing, since both Knuckles and Tails have more involved abilities for their double button presses. Plus, it does help with attacking enemies in midair, thankfully, since it extends the range of attack. It also works with a new elemental shield introduced here. We got 3 elements in play: fire, lightning, and water for the bubble. All 3 characters gain immunity from the requisite elements with the shield, not needing to worry about air underwater with the bubble shield and pulling in rings with the lightning shield. But Sonic in particular gains a different mid-air ability with each of these shields. A conventional double jump with lightning, a dash forward through the air with fire, and a bounce down and up with bubble.
And that's about it for the main man himself, at least before we get into the special stuff. However, our 2 other options are a bit more interesting than the big man.
Despite this being Tails' second major role, it's the first time he's actually been an even slightly interesting character. Yeah, for some reason, despite his flight being established back in Sonic 2, this is the first time the player can actually fly as him. It can make levels easier by opening up all 4 directions of movement, and even open up unique shortcuts to him. It's actually interesting, if you're playing with Sonic and Tails together, you can have Tails lift Sonic up in flight, but only with a second player. It's just not accessible in single player. Weird, but I guess it makes sense for balancing. Did make the couple times I used the flying in my playthrough, with both of them troublesome. You ever try controlling a Sonic game with 2 controls at once? As for Knuckles, honestly I didn't play as Knuckles this playthrough. Look, I'm not playing this whole damn game multiple times just to give a fairer and more recent assessment. Knuckles can glide through the air, climb up walls, break through certain walls just by walking through them, but in exchange, he's slightly slower and jumps slightly lower. He even has his own special routes through certain levels, which does actually tempt me to play through again just to go through them, but look, this already took me 3 days to beat. I'm not spending a full work week on the funny and Knuckles meme game.
Oh, what? Like I suddenly have standards for how I spend my time? What else am I gonna do with the time? Sit around and yearn?
Now we could get into the actual levels now, but it's important to note it's not just the standard zones to play through. This game introduces a new method of accessing the Chaos Emerald granting special stages, giant rings, hidden throughout the game, from Angel Island to Lava Reef. This is probably my favorite way of accessing the special stages thus far. It's not dependent on keeping a ton of rings, it incentivizes exploration while not being completely unreasonable to find, and unlike the special stages in Sonic 2, you don't lose all your rings for going in. These lead to blue spheres, which are also probably my favorite of the special stages we've gotten thus far. They're plenty challenging, especially if you're trying to get the perfects on each one by collecting every single ring. You have to make rectangles with red spheres surrounding blue, and it will transform the full thing into rings to collect. 50 rings gets a continue, a perfect gets a guaranteed continue from score, and if you turn all the blue spheres into red ones or rings, you get yourself a Chaos Emerald. Or if you get all the Chaos Emeralds in Sonic 3 and jump into a giant ring in Sonic and Knuckles, you can collect the Super Emeralds, which unlock Super Tails, Super Knuckles, and most notably, Hypersonic. It's so good, if you lock on Sonic and Knuckles to any Genesis game other than Sonic 2 or 3, you get to play a Blue Sphere stage independently.
And if you lock it on Sonic 1, you get all 134,217,728 Blue Spheres levels. Holy shit! I mean, I know they're procedurally generated, but still.
However, don't think there isn't any incentive to collecting a ton of rings prior to Supersonic. If you have 20 rings or more when passing a checkpoint, you get the chance to jump into one of 3 bonus stages. These are extremely simple minigames, mostly just for getting power-ups, rings, and lives. You have a gumball machine that drops power-ups where you bounce up to hit the lever. You have a slot machine where you can get and lose tons of rings and even get continues for getting over 50 rings. And you have whatever you want to call the bonus stages where you sprint around glowing balls of light, collect rising balloons of power-ups, and avoid the eternally rising vortex at the bottom. Altogether, not the most interesting mini-games ever, but they are fun and can be pretty helpful.
My least favorite definitely has to be the slot machine. The other two are all purely beneficial, but the slot machine can literally steal all your rings if you just have a bit of bad luck. All told though, these are pretty good ideas, and very good distractions from the main gameplay that don't completely break the flow of the game.
Now there's one more thing about the gameplay I still haven't talked about. What was it? Oh yeah, Supersonic! Yes, for the first time in this project, I actually collected all those damn emeralds, Chaos and Super, so I can finally talk about the yellow hedgehog with some degree of authority. It's alright.
Well, that take was worth 5 hours on Blue Spheres.
Don't get me wrong, when it works, it really works, and can give you a power trip like no other. When you get 50 rings after collecting 7 emeralds and double jump without an elemental shield,
already with more requirements than there should be,
you activate Supersonic, or if you collected all the Super Emeralds, Hypersonic. Supersonic is completely invincible to everything, except crushing hazards and bottomless pits. Oh, and he can still drown. But he can move super fast at all times, which makes any of the platforming moments in the game harder than they were meant to be. And don't forget, the whole time Super or Hyper mode are activated, you're losing rings, and once you run out, you drop to full vulnerability with no rings, so anything can kill you in one hit. But hey, you get to ignore enemies until you run out.
Yeah, not the biggest fan of Supersonic, at least in the classic style of games. I don't dislike it necessarily, but it's not my cup of tea. Sorry. Hypersonic is interesting since it has the ability to boost in midair, which I could have sworn used up a bunch of rings at once, but that might be in a later game's super form. In any case, I appreciate it as a fun reward for collecting all 14 emeralds, but I think most of the time I prefer to stick to normal Sonic. Besides, the levels honestly don't need the boost and fun factor most of the time.
Oh my god, these levels are incredible. I'm not going to go in-depth on all of them, because if I do, I'm going to have to cover all 25 acts, and I do want to move on to the 3D games at some point this year. However, I will say, these are some of the best levels I've played thus far. Angel Island Zone starts out more jungle than the previous starting stages, and ends by being part grass zone, part fire level, part water level. Hydrocity may have been the first level where I actually ran out of air in this project, but it's still fun and kinetic, and the slides are just a fun idea. Marble Garden is really mazy, but the spinning tops are a fun and creative way of gaining height and distance, and I think the aesthetic looks great. Again, maybe just my bias towards 16-bit ruins. Carnival Night used up a ton of my lives, mainly because I didn't understand the Act 1 boss and I was going for the final Chaos Emeralds there, but it's honestly my favorite of the casino-style levels thus far, and I love the balloons. Also, this zone has its own water sections, interestingly. Ice Cap is the loopiest, most physics-based level in the game, and I love the initial snowboarding sequence, even if it is very much just a stylistic thing. Finally, Launch Base Zone, the final zone is Sonic 3, which is engaging and climactic, plus it feels like solving a puzzle even while you're just trying to take the path of least resistance. It also has a couple of areas underwater, huh?
Yeah, for some reason, Sonic 3 has a lot of water sections, like a disproportionate number of them. They aren't terrible, thankfully, though the bubbles here feel off.
Mushroom Hill does this neat seasonal switch with its second act, which is very appreciated, and it does a great job as both an intro level for Sonic and Knuckles and the midpoint of the full package. Flying Battery is fun and kinetic, and I like all three bosses, though I wish there were less occasions where you had to loop through the same area twice in order to actually progress. Sandopolis has a really good Act 1, I like the Falling and Rising Sands, its method of navigation, but Act 2 is really the only act in the game I dislike because of the switches that have to be pushed, and the Rising Sands that can crush you, and constantly worrying about lights, and yeah. Lava Reef is a step back into the high quality. I like how if you get the Fire Shield or Master Supersonic, this level is basically just a freebie. Why do you start Act 2 walking on invisible ground, though? Hidden Palace is mostly just a boss fight against Knuckles, but it's a fun boss fight, and I like the aesthetics here, so it gets a pass from me. Sky Sanctuary is really cool. I like the fights against Mecha Sonic where he calls back to boss fights from the first two games. There are a ton of chances to use Supersonic well, and it all feels super climactic. Finally, Death Egg Zone, the last zone in the Sonic 3 and Knuckles experience. It's hectic, high-paced, we get a ton of gravity gimmicks, and it's only held back by the Act 2 bosses being an absolute cavalcade of bullshit. I had like at least 35 continues before I got to that Jam Giant mech, and then I ended the game with like half that. Why is there no rings? Oh, but the true final boss is fun and challenging. I like boosting into him at the end, it's great.
And that is it! Sonic 3 and Knuckles beaten, and if it wasn't already clear, this is hands down the best of the classic Sonic games. It's the best designed, it's the best playing, it's far and away the biggest, and it's all around just an absolute blast to play through. Overall, I think it's a strong note for the classic Sonic era to go out on, though given my thoughts on the other games, maybe not the most indicative note. I think Sonic 2 is good, and Sonic 1 had its moments, but for the most part, the first game was painful, CD was forgettable, and even 2 had a serious drop-off at the end. But Sonic 3 and Knuckles is genuinely an amazing game, the kind that really solidifies the series as legendary. And we were getting these games on a yearly basis, so people had every reason to believe that very soon we would get the next big, wonderful, and universally acclaimed Sonic game. How does 1998 sound to y'all?